All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at the National Conservation Training Center here in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. My name is Gwyneth Daunton, and today's webinar is titled The Changing Landscape for Migratory Forest Birds. And we're very excited to have a bunch of panelists here today who will share their expertise on this topic. We have Amanda Duren, Dr. Amber Roth, Jayme Strange, Dr. Keith McKnight, and Dr. Randy Dettmers. And so we'll be introducing these folks a little bit later, but first we're going to do some pre-webinar items. First, we have audio. No one can speak during this, but we do have closed captioning available from our wonderful interpreters. We also have ASL as well. And so if you need any of those things, they should be there for you. If not, let us know in the chat and we'll try our best to get those up and running and in a better spot for you to see them. I'd also like to start this webinar with sharing NCTC's land acknowledgement. So we understand that the National Conservation Training Center is located on the unceded ancestral lands of many indigenous people. We cannot find the full account, but we are aware that many people traverse and cherish and live on this land. These people include, but are not limited to, the Massawomack, Haudenosaunee, the Shawnee, and the Delaware. And if you would be interested in learning who lived or traversed your land, let me know in the comments in the chat, and I can send you a link on how you can find more about who could have resided on your land. Here at the National Conservation Training Center, we also are an organization that welcomes everyone. We acknowledge our agency's histories and strive to be a site of cultural transformation for our organization and larger conservation community, making it more representative of the aspirations of the American people. And we strive to foster an environment where everyone can learn new skills and find common ground and explore new ways of engaging in nature. And we find that your contribution is valued, and we love that you guys are here. Quick disclaimer, this product is for educational uses only, and the views, opinions, or positions expressed in this webinar series are those of the guest presenters and do not necessarily reflect the opinions, positions, or views of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the Department of the Interior. Some of the materials and images may be protected by copyright or have been licensed to us by a third party and are restricted in their use. Mention of any product names, companies, web links, textbooks, or other references does not imply federal endorsement. That being said, we will be adding some web links into the chat if you guys are interested in learning more about this, but again, not federally endorsed. So just a quick overview. You can introduce yourself via chat, even though that you can't talk to us. This is being recorded, and so it will be then posted to YouTube or also on NCTC's website. So if you have to leave for a meeting, we got you. You can watch it later. If you have any questions for our wonderful panelists, you can use the Q&A box, which you can see it's on the right side of the screen in the little red box. And so, yeah, please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. We love seeing where you guys are all from. To better view this panelist, you should go to Gallery. You can use that by going to the top right corner where you can see the view and going down to this little squares. And then if you go down to gallery mode, then you can see all of our lovely faces. And so without further ado, Amanda, do you want to finish us off?
Sure. Thanks everybody so much for being here. I'm actually going to invite our speakers to do their self-introductions. Before we do that, I just want to acknowledge the Forest Ecology Working Group of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and our many partners. So NCTC, of course, the USDA Northern Forest Climate Hub, the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, and USDA Forest Service are all part of the sponsors that make this whole series possible. Huge thanks to Gwyneth, to Lindsay, to Jim, and to Haven for their help with today's webinar. So with that, I believe we can go ahead and do the Brady Bunch thing. And oh, and I should remind us, okay, so today we're talking about the changing landscape for migratory birds, and we hope to have a webinar for you next month. I'm sorry I don't have the title right in front of me, but the information is on the NCTC website. So you can see information on the next panel in our series. So with that, Now I think we can do the Brady Bunch thing. So of our speakers, I'm going to ask them to, decide who wants to go first, and we can popcorn off each other. I've asked them to introduce themselves, not just by name, title, etc., but also by sharing a story about a career highlight moment for you in your work with migratory forest birds. So, of our panelists that are listed, Amanda, Amber, Jayme, Keith, or Randy, would anyone like to go first? Sharing a career highlight in your work with migratory forest birds. And I will call on you if I don't hear from you.
I'm happy to start off, Amanda.
Go for it, Randy.
Um, I'm Randy Dettmers. I'm a biologist with the Migratory Bird Program with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm in the Northeast region in our regional office in Massachusetts. And a little career highlight story for me is back several years ago. I was collaborating with one of my longtime collaborators who was with the USGS Cooperative Research Unit in West Virginia at West Virginia University, and we were working on developing a project to look at how both forest fragmentation and forest management was impacting forest birds in sort of that central Appalachian area. And we were going out and trying to identify some sites, particularly on private lands, to sort of assess how management there compared to some of the public land management. And on this particular day, we were visiting three different sites. And the first one we went to was a property that had been acquired from a private landowner, had had a lot of high grading, removing valuable timber from it over the years, but left it in a condition that was not super for wildlife. There were a lot of small, scraggly trees, not much in terms of large diameter trees. And we kind of walked in there and we were like, yeah, this is probably not going to be a place where we see some of the birds that we're really interested in. But, it still is a representative of how some of these private lands have been managed over time. The next site we went to was an area that was owned by one of the larger timber companies in the area, and it had been managed in an even-aged sort of condition. It was probably, somewhere 60 to 70 years old, but had very little management done to it. And so it was a lot of very tall trees with closed canopy, very little understory, very little midstory, and it was just almost silent in that stand. There's probably a lot of timber value in there, but it wasn't much for the wildlife either. And there may have been a few red-eyed vireos singing here or there, but that was about it. And then we went to this third site that was also a timber company site, but had been managed collaboratively with the West Virginia DNR and had some, some small group selection cuts, some wildlife openings. There were still a lot of large trees, but canopy gaps, and there was understory and there was midstory, and there were just birds galore. And in that, that one day, it was just a great kind of, lesson about if these forests can be managed in a way to create those diversity of conditions, it's great for wildlife.
Awesome. Thank you, Randy. That's a great story. And I like your background photo, by the way. Yay. Who wants to popcorn off of Randy and go next? Amber, go ahead.
I'll volunteer next. Hi, everyone. I am Amber Roth. I'm an associate professor of forest wildlife management at the University of Maine, which is home to the Wabanaki people. Going back to our land acknowledgement. And for me, my story is a story of stories, I guess. I started working with forest birds back in the 1990s and helped other students with their research by helping them catching and banding birds for various questions. Fast forward to around 2007, I began leading my own research involving capturing and banding golden wing warblers and American woodcock and other forest birds. And at that point, it was really important to me to make my research accessible to other people, regardless of their age or their background. I feel like science is not always something people feel very well connected to. And so it's one of my goals to make it that more accessible to people. And I feel like one of the most magical moments for people is to place a wild bird in their hands for the first time. And no matter if that person is a 7-year-old child or an 80-year-old woman who's terminally ill, it always generates a smile. It creates forever memories for them. They feel more a part of the research and a part of science. And for me, that's probably the most kind of exciting part of some of the things that I do as a researcher. Uh, I also have found many people to be volunteers or field technicians through those activities. Just happened on Saturday. I had an event and somebody's volunteering to be part of a project. And so I try to make the science accessible to anybody, and I welcome volunteers no matter what their background is to participate. And that extends also to students. I'm obviously at a university, and I have projects that don't always have like a graduate student on them, but I always try to involve students in all aspects of the project and giving them hands-on training. Some people have learned how to put tags on birds for the first time. But in the end, I think the message is that migratory forest birds are great teachers and they're great ambassadors, and they do a lot, I think, to expand our ability to conserve forests and apply science to conservation problems.
Wow, great points. Thank you for that, Amber. Who would like to go next? Jayme.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. I'm Jayme Strange. I am the Northern Forest Conservation Delivery Network Coordinator for American Bird Conservancy and the Upper Mississippi Great Lakes Joint Venture. I am located in the beautiful state of Wisconsin, right along the Mississippi River. So I feel very lucky about that. But I have a very short career with migratory birds, unlike Randy and Amber. But I do have one event last summer. I went out to Camp Ripley with a U.S. Fish and Wildlife biologist, and we did wood thrush tagging for Modus. And it was a very fascinating, like it was really great to see the like how you catch the birds, how you tag them, hold the birds. What was cool about seeing Camp Ripley in Minnesota is it's a sentinel landscape, which is a coalition of federal agencies, state agencies, county, local, private organizations that are working with landowners to manage in a sustainable practices around a military installment. So it was just a really creative way to see how we can manage land alongside some of our land use while also building off of partnerships. And then they are supporting the science that Amber was just talking about, where, seeing where wood thrush are migrating to and working down in the non-breeding grounds and the wintering grounds. So they're also tagging in Central and South America. So just seeing that full annual cycle with that project, it was just a really fun project to be a part of. And then just to see how working across the landscape with partnerships is benefiting birds and the forest. I also got to hold a golden wing warbler while in a chestnut-sided warbler too. So it was a great experience to just be part of the birds and in the forest and see all of those management.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jayme. We're hearing about a bunch of different landscapes, which is part of the purpose of these introductions. Let's see, between Amanda and Keith, who wants to go next?
I can go next.
Okay, thank you, Keith.
So I'm Keith McKnight. I'm the coordinator of the Lower Mississippi Valley Joint Venture Partnership. I'm located in Northeast Texas, in Tyler, Texas. My story is going to be a little bit different than the tack that others have taken. Tried to think of something that stuck out to me and is meaningful. And several years back now, I was fortunate to be involved in organizing 700,000 acre celebration for the Wetlands Reserve Program in the Mississippi Alluvial Valley. And what struck me then and still strikes me today, as we listened to speakers, we had a tour, we talked about the impact of that program on the Mississippi Alluvial Valley geography, is that although I'd been with the joint venture office for several years, I had absolutely nothing to do with the accomplishment that we were celebrating, and that there were literally hundreds of people who had been involved for decades in achieving that milestone. And then the next sort of step to that in my story is that we are gearing up for a 1 million acre celebration for wetland preserve in the Mississippi Alluvial Valley in the very near future. And so to me, we I totally agree, and we're all energized by the birds themselves. Well, we do what we do. And so those stories and those experiences are invaluable. And at the same time, the work that is necessary to make a change at a landscape scale is enormous. And I'm just fortunate that I get to work in a part of the world where the partnership is rich, and the people, as they are all over the country, are dedicated and able to celebrate some changes. We're talking about landscape change, forest change, in a way that, at least in this one way, is positive. That's mine.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Keith. So speaking of partnerships and joint ventures, Amanda.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Amanda Duren. I'm the Director of Conservation Partnerships for the Appalachian Mountains Joint Venture, and I'm based in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. There's a couple of us on the call today that are with joint ventures, and if anyone's not familiar with migratory bird joint ventures, we are partnerships of state and federal agencies, nonprofits, universities, and other organizations focused on bird conservation, and in my case, in the Appalachian Mountains region of the eastern US. And I've spent most of my career with the Appalachian Mountains Joint Venture to this point, but before I was in the position I'm in now, I coordinated a state level bird conservation partnership. And in that role, a lot of my work focused on understanding and promoting the benefits of forest management for birds. So I spent a lot of time with managers learning about what those practices were, and time with researchers learning about the impacts those practices had on birds. And at one point, I met with a forester at one of the properties that we were working with, and he told me that there was a group of birders that were opposed to the management. They didn't agree with the management that they were doing on the property, and that the entire management program was actually at risk of being stopped because of this opposition. So he asked me if I'd be willing to speak with them and help share about the value of forest management for birds, and said I would try. I wasn't sure if they'd listen to me, but I'd be happy to speak with them and try. And instead of doing a presentation or something like that for them, I said, why don't we go birding together? And what better way to connect with people than to go out in the woods and look at birds together? So I told them, tell me where your favorite birding spot is. Let's meet there. So they sent me the location, and I got out of the car, and it was this place that had been managed very recently. It was a clear cut, maybe 5 or 6 years post harvest. And they got out and they said, this is our favorite place to find yellow-breasted chats. And the rest of the day kind of continued that way. And ultimately, the birds made the argument for me that sustainable forest management can be a tool to make great bird habitat. But that was really impactful for me, not only because of connecting with people over birds, but because it was a way for me to realize that you can have the best science, you can have really good, solid research behind your management, but if you don't have the people that love those places on board with you and understanding why you're doing it, then you're not going to be successful.
Thank you for that, Amanda. So in all these introductions, we've definitely already heard some common themes about the value of forests and forest management, the value of the birds and the stories that they can tell about the forest management, and also different ways of interacting with people that make decisions that influence that changing landscape. So thank you so much for those introductions. A reminder to our participants, if you have questions, you can type them in the Q&A box, which is separate from the chat, and Haven's going to collate those, and we will get to a Q&A section in a little bit here. But now we're going to segue into our panel discussion. So we're going to kind of weave through forests and birds and people. So I'd love for our panelists to kind of popcorn off each other and describe in a little greater detail the forest habitat that you work in. How has this changed over time? And you're welcome to go landscape scale, 700,000 or a million acres of lower Mississippi, floodplain forest, or you can go micro scale and talk about within gap and bark or whatever gets you jazzed and excited. But so describe the forest habitat that you work in and how has this landscape changed over time? Micro, macro scale, whatever floats your boat. Randy, we haven't heard from you in a few minutes. Do you mind if I pick on you again?
Sure, that's fine, Amanda. I guess my reflection on that is I've mostly worked probably in sort of the central hardwoods regions of the East, as well as some northern hardwoods. And when I started my career, we're probably focused a bit more on landscape level kind of considerations for forests around ideas of forest fragmentation and patch size and how that impacted birds. And I think over the years, as we've actually seen, more forest regrowing in lots of the East. Not that those concerns aren't still there. We're all very aware of the need for large forest patches and reducing fragmentation, but I think we've become even more attuned to the fact that what happens to those forests at the landscape level, but then down at the stand and sort of smaller scales in terms of, like Amanda was talking about, with how those forests are actually managed or allowed to be disturbed over time to maintain a diversity of structures and composition, which ultimately is what helps, sustain a diversity of birds and wildlife in general. And so I think we've become more attuned to that, but realized over time as well that with in the East so much private land, the opportunities for managing those lands, they aren't necessarily more limited, but there are challenges to working with multiple landowners, private landowners, over large landscapes, and trying to figure out how to influence those landscapes towards a healthier forest over time.
I'll be the first to jump in and get on the train that Randy started. It's much the same in our geography, where the landscape considerations have not gone away, and there's still a lot of impetus behind the landscape scale. But as that has progressed in the Mississippi Alluvial Valley, and as it has always existed, there are really two broad forest types that we have great interest in the Lower Mississippi Valley joint venture. One is bottomland hardwood, but the other is upland pine, mixed pine. And the common denominator for both of those is structure, and it is more the local micro scale considerations that we are simultaneously promoting with the landscape. Less so. There's a lot of forest in the West Gulf Coastal Plain, but there's much less forest that's in the structural condition that we would prefer, and certainly the wildlife would prefer. So between essentially canopy cover, which is a driving factor, and fire in the West Gulf Coastal Plain, and then canopy and structural diversity in bottomland hardwoods, that's the broken record that we tend to be with managers, practitioners, and landowners. And then, just like Randy, finding ways to help make that happen on private land, particularly the management, particularly with the vagaries of markets. For the result of that often is the ongoing challenge.
Thanks. I saw Amber put her hand up too.
Yeah, I'm happy to build off of what others have been talking about. Um, a lot of my research over the years is focused on young forests, and that could be softwood forests where you might find bignell thrushes and rusty blackbirds, or it could be golden-winged warbler habitat, which is more hardwood oriented. And I think one of the biggest challenges of working in young forests, kind of going back to what Amanda was talking about, is the challenges of convincing people that not only is active forest management a good thing, but that practices like clear cutting are not always bad, and that they can be done in a way that is sustainable, that's appropriate for the trees you're trying to regenerate, and is also really good for many bird species. Like, many that I just mentioned all require kind of dense, young, shrubby stuff that nobody likes to really walk through, but it's like the perfect place for protection and food and all sorts of resources for those species. And one of the challenges has been trying to like sell people on that. And I think that's another benefit of some of the workshops and tours and things that I've done, is trying to get people to realize that these places are not wastelands that are devoid of wildlife. They are actually brimming with wildlife, which most people don't realize. And what I see as one of the big wins is, I used to work with a bird club in northern Wisconsin, and they always went to these old growth forests or they went to mature forests all the time. And I brought them out to young aspen clear cuts, and they were shocked at what they were finding there. They were seeing birds they had never seen before because they had never gone to young forests before. And it became a tradition for them where every year they do a field trip to these places now that they never used to before. And I think those are the kinds of things that I think kind of turn people's opinions about different kinds of forest practices, makes them realize that there's really a lot to offer from a range of different types of forest practices, and that when you cut all the trees down, that's not the end of your forest. In many ways, it's really the beginning, and it's a great place for many forest birds. So that's my addition.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Amber. I think that a lot of people don't realize the value of young forests to wildlife, but I think just to kind of go back to what Randy was saying, and Keith as well, the systems that I work in the Appalachian Mountains also over time have become much more uniform, and a lot of that is a result of the secondary regrowth of those forests after the widespread harvesting and logging in the logging era of the 1800s, early 1900s, and the forests that were cut down in those times, those ancient forests, were very different than the forests that have grown back in their place, and they lack diversity essentially in most cases, in structure, in age of trees, in the species of trees. And so Amber was speaking great points about the value of young forests, but what was lost in that logging was also the vast majority of the old growth forests that we have too. So both ends of those age spectrums are missing. And of course, there's a lot more management tools we can use to help bring back some of those young forests that are missing. There's fewer options for creating some of the habitat conditions associated with old growth, but generally at kind of a landscape scale, the lack of diversity in different canopy structural conditions, different understory structural conditions, and ages of the forest is having a lot of impacts on the value of the forests that are remaining on the landscape for wildlife.
Yeah, I don't want to keep repeating what everyone else is saying, but I work in the northern Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, so the boreal hardwood transition zone. And I have the opportunity to work with like large forest tracts. So there are still large forests intact in BCR 12. Yes, much of it has been simplified from the first cutover when European settlers came over, but it's a mature second growth stand. So there are some, like, we're getting into that second round of mature growth in some of the forests I work with, but the large removal of some natural disturbances on the landscape is hard for the bird species. We like to think here in the Northwoods that it's a bird buffet for the breeding birds, and to provide a biodiversity on your stand will bring all of those birds in. They'll eat all the caterpillars, all the different fruits and nuts that are provided by some of these trees. It's just super beneficial. And when you see all those different bird species, it's going to tell you that you have a healthy forest. Another thing too that I think of how the landscape has changed is the increase of white-tailed deer browse on conifers. So that reduces a lot of that biodiversity in some of those stands. And then we also are seeing a lot of pests and like spruce bedworm and emerald ash borer is just getting to our northern Minnesota stands, which if nobody knows, northern Minnesota has a lot of ash. So it's definitely a concern, and it's changing constantly. But there are little things that we can do across the landscape that will support the health of our forests and birds.
Thank you. I love these responses. I'm wondering if we can dig a little deeper on the micro scale a little bit. So, structural diversity, what does that look like in the forests that you work in? And we've talked a bit about diversity across the landscape, but I'd love to hear you describe a little in greater detail. What does that structural diversity look like for the birds that you care about?
At a micro scale, in the forest that I work in, the structural diversity looks like having some areas of the stand where there's open canopy conditions, the sunlight can reach the forest floor. There's a lot of vegetation growing right at the forest floor level. There's other areas where maybe a single tree fell, or there's a smaller opening and there's some mid-story growth in that section. And there's other areas where maybe the mid-story is more open and closed canopy conditions. So it's this intermixing of different areas where there's dense growth at different levels of the forest, and having that variety offers birds and other wildlife the diversity of conditions that they need to find places for things like nesting or finding food or cover and protection from predators. So the more diversity in structure and different growth forms of different species of trees, different sizes and ages of trees provides more opportunities for those things to happen.
Can I jump in? As somebody that studies habitat, I look at these characteristics a lot. And so a lot of it's about vertical structure, horizontal structure, and it can include things like, so I talked about young forests, but young forests sometimes need important elements. And like golden wing warbler needs retained canopy trees throughout those areas. You don't want to cut everything down. You want to leave some structure behind that's actually preferred for them. So I think that's an important element, particularly in that system. And also thinking about things like we think a lot about live trees, but we don't always think about dead trees and how important snags and downwood are for a variety of forest wildlife and the food that they're eating, and returning nutrients to the soil, and the many different functions that downwood can provide. Like those are really important elements. And, thinking about, we like to talk about the wall of green here in Maine, where you think about having vegetation at all levels in your forest, having understory, midstory, overstory, and, how that provides niches for a lot of different species by having that structural diversity present, as well as compositional diversity as well. Composition and structure sometimes go together in terms of what you might find in a place, right? But I will stop there because I could go on and on about habitat characteristics. So
I may pick on you more in the future. Thank you, Amber. Jayme, I saw you unmuted next.
Yeah, I mean, Amber brought in the deadwood, and I think I like to think of it in the bird's point of view, and I get this from the NRRI team at Duluth, Minnesota. That's the Natural Resources Institute. Anyways, they look at think of it as you don't eat your supper in your living room, right? So you want to provide that structural diversity along with biodiversity of different species, so that like if there's a conifer, like the birds are going to hide and hang out in the conifers, especially like rough grouse in the winter. They're going to use that conifer for protection from the snow and the cold. But like, yeah, golden wing warbler is a good example. They like to nest in the brushy young stuff, but the males will sing from a tall standing tree. So it's just providing all of that brings in a wildlife, and just going into like the soil of carbon from the for the wood, the dead wood, there are tons of woodpeckers and other cavity species like the boreal chickadee that will put food in those cavities and they will survive off of that the whole winter. So it's just providing that structural diversity and different successional stages is super beneficial.
Awesome, thank you. Keith, I wonder if you can clue us. Oh, go ahead, Amber. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say that somebody brought up a really good point in the chat, and we can let Keith talk first, but I just wanted to see if we could come back to that before we move on.
Okay, I'll take a peek at the chat. But yeah, Keith, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about the perspective from the Lower Mississippi. What structure looks like there.
Yeah, so in general, it's no different than what everyone else has said. Different setting, different perhaps mix of species, but the same needs and same concerns. The one thing that I was going to say, and the truth, bottomland hardwood forest experts will snicker when I say this, but it's okay. I'm going to say it anyway. An anecdotal story. When I first entered into a role that would have me understand bottomland hardwood desired forest conditions, I had this vision of old growth, an old untouched bottomland hardwood forest where it was essentially like the old photo that you see of really old longleaf pine. They're all huge and roughly the same size, and you see all the way through. Well, I just replaced that with big hardwood trees, big oaks. That's what this thing must have looked like back when. And the first time I was introduced to an old growth bottomland hardwood forest, at first I was disappointed. And then I realized, it was pointed out to me, I could stand, and at each cardinal direction, the view that I had was, if you took a photo and showed those 4 photos to someone, they might think you were in a different forest each time. So no matter which direction you look, there might be that super old emergent tree. You look another direction and there's a blowdown with very young, and then there all points in between at the same point in the forest. And so I guess that's my anecdote regarding the diversity of structure and character within the forest. And I guess the other thing that I would say is, we talk about the importance of the extremes. Amanda talked about loss of the old growth, loss of the young, and in a way, and for us, in the way we look at desired forest conditions in our part of the world, the landscape consideration is part of what helps you understand and define what those parameters are. And when you've got too much of something, is it a 2,000 acre clear cut, or is it a 40 acre clear cut? Do you have a whole bunch of those 40 acre clear cuts across a 10,000 acre area? So I think all of those conditions, we understand all those various structural attributes and conditions attend to different needs of different species, and the mix and the proper proportion and all of that's where the larger landscape view begins to be really important to help define and keep folks from running too hard to one extreme or the other.
Wonderful, thank you. Amber, I don't know if this is a question that you were looking at, but I want to pitch a question to Randy that I saw in the chat. Thanks, Jeff. But Jeff was wondering if you can talk about particular needs at different life stages. So, okay, great.
That's it. That's the one.
Yeah, I figured that was the one you were looking at too, Amber. And I think what Keith was just talking about really segues with that perfectly, because many of these forest birds that we have in the East, after they are finished nesting, post-fledging, both the young and even the adults to some degree may seek out some fairly different conditions that they're looking for, because of the cover or the food availability that changes, during over time. and what they're looking for at particular life stages. And so having that, mosaic of different structures and ages and compositions across the landscape is exactly what these forest birds need, so that they can find, their kitchen and their living room and their bedroom and some place to vacation during different parts of their life stage. So that it's all part of those full annual cycle needs of these species as they work through their different life stages. And Amber, I don't know if you want to add to that at all.
I would love to add to that. Actually, that was exactly some of the things I was thinking. I think the other thing that we need to think about is we're talking about migratory birds. And some of these life stages don't occur in Eastern North America, which is what we've largely been talking about to this point. And, I think to really be thoughtful about what these birds need, we need to think much broader and internationally in terms of where these birds are spending their whole year. And, a lot of these birds are only with us here in the north for 3 to 4 months, and the rest of the year they're somewhere else. And that's migratory habitat, that's winter habitat, and it's forests, but it's often very different kinds of forests that they're using at different times of the year, which often does relate also to different life stages as well. And part of the challenge of conserving these migratory forest birds is trying to understand where problems are occurring in their life cycle and what the life stages are perhaps limiting in terms of the demography, the population trend for the species. Migratory species are tough. I mean, there's just a lot going on. They're in a lot of places and they move fast. Like they're hard to keep up with. So finding out where to pinpoint the real problems, because many of our forest birds are declining, right? So how do we know where the real problem is? And, is it problems on the breeding grounds? Is it on the wintering grounds? Are they not making it back and forth between the two? I think are really important to think about, and what those forests all look like. Because clearly they're going to be different forest types and different forest conditions in different places. Because many of them are traversing sometimes thousands of miles, right? To get to where they're going. So I think that's an important element of this, which we went to the other extreme from very micro to very macro there, Anya, Amanda, but anyway.
Well, we did say it's about the changing landscape for migratory forest birds. So there's a lot, and there's changes over time, over space, micro, macro scale. There's a lot we can talk about. And for our listeners that are from the western half of the United States, we're trying to limit this to the eastern half just to focus our conversation a little bit. So thank you for your patience with us as we talk about the eastern flyway and the Mississippi flyway, but we have some great lessons to translate to any landscape. So we've talked a bit about, I don't know, I'm sorry, I'd love if anybody else has comments, if you didn't get to go, Jayme or Amanda, if you wanted to add on to that, you're welcome to. Jayme's good.
Yeah, I'll just add briefly, I was thinking back to some work that was led by Amanda Rodewald looking at forest bird use in Southeast Ohio of some recently harvested areas. And I remember looking at the species list and highest numbers of captures of different species in a shelterwood harvest, which is a practice where you leave some proportion of the overstory trees to create good conditions for regrowth of species like oak. And so it's very still pretty open habitat. And I remember reading down this list, and it was ovenbird, worm-eating warbler, hooded warbler, wood thrush, scarlet tanager. Those were the top species. And I was really shocked by that because at that point in my career, I had a very specific view of those species as being mature forest birds and was under the impression that they spent most of their time there. And the piece that we often focus on, the breeding, is the nesting period specifically is obviously very important, but to Amber's point, it's one piece in a very big puzzle. And so we have to be using a broader lens when we're thinking about the habitat that these different species need, and that we are doing a bit of a disservice to some of these species if we think that we can capture everything they need by just managing for one tiny part of their life cycle. So think even when you have a pretty clear understanding of the breeding habitat for any of these species. They may need lots of other different types of structure and habitats to be successful throughout the full season.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you for those reminders. I love all the themes that we're hearing. Jayme, I saw you unmuted. Did you want to add something?
Yeah. And Amanda reminded me that not just looking at one species, but looking at cohorts or species. And I see Lindsay Grayson's been adding them to the chat, but Forestry for the Birds programs are really great programs to kind of give those management techniques that are science-based, but they're looking at species cohorts of birds to specific states. So I think it started in Vermont, but here in the Great Lakes, we have Forestry for Michigan birds and Forestry for Minnesota birds, which just released like a week ago. But I think Lindsay posted some out west. So if you are from out west, you can tune into those programs. And they're not just a guidebook for like management practices, they're also an initiative. So there is a working group behind this with experts that people can reach out to and get information and talk about the science and monitoring and the different management practices that people are potentially experimenting on properties. So just something to think about. And Indiana, someone just shouted out Indiana. There's a ton of different programs. So check it out if you have time.
Yeah, and since I've got you all, that's actually perfectly segues into sort of my next question is about those management techniques. So what management techniques are needed to recreate, the habitat features that are missing on the landscapes right now for the migratory forest birds? Are there some that speak to you or ones, or if you'd rather, you could like, what are ones that you've found effective in communicating with the public around a certain bird or something? So stories about particular birds, links to management techniques, or whatever floats your boat. Love to hear it. Amber.
Can I kick that off? This was actually a sort of a question I just had for my PhD student on his comprehensive exams was, are we experiencing a paradigm shift in terms of how we manage forests? And I was asking him specifically about ecological forestry, and I feel like we are more conscious of how forests processes work. We know more about disturbance regimes. We know more than just about the structures and composition, which is what a lot of how forest was managed historically was based on, and on like productivity goals. But now we're starting to see that we can mimic those processes with our silviculture, with the way we manage our forests, and how can we do that in a way that continues to create these diverse habitats for birds and other wildlife, but at the same time still be able to kind of extract the forest products that we all depend on, like 2x4s and cardboard boxes and toilet paper and, important things that we all like. Like how do we balance that, right? And so the way that we manage our forests, I think has shifted and is increasingly being thoughtful about how do forests function, without humans in the system, and how do we, as humans in the system, try to do a better job of being thoughtful about the many processes that are happening. And so I think in terms of like an overarching kind of start to the topic, I feel like that kind of general shift in how we think about our forests is an important direction that we've headed in.
So, madam, my response to that may be aggravatingly to you, not on point for how you directed it. I would say that, especially with our desired forest conditions for wildlife and bottomland hardwood, all the techniques are on the table. We're very careful to communicate that we don't prescribe anything. What we propose to do is describe the desired conditions, and then based on the site, based on the landowner's objectives, which can be all over the place, and based on conversations with their management professional, then they decide what the right tools are in their situation to work towards those desired conditions. And since I'm talking about that, I'll give a shameless plug. I see Jeff Denman is out there in webinar land. He provided a good comment. He's one of the co-editors of our newly revised desired forest conditions document, which is any minute now gonna hit the streets. Shout out to Jeff.
Yeah. The Lower Mississippi Joint Venture has some very awesome work. So definitely I encourage people to check out the links. Thanks for that. Other thoughts, comments? Habitat features?
Yeah, I'll shout out to prescribed burning. That's a really great management technique that we can do in the forest or on adjacent prairies like oak ecosystems and such. Really easy way to just reset the system and then bring back a lot of biodiversity. And it's very beneficial for invasive species here in the Great Lakes state. Just get rid of those invasives that don't handle the fire, but the local native plants have they have gone through time with fire over many years. So yeah, I would say prescribe burn. But another thing too I thought about when you asked this is in Ottawa National Forest, they have a very interesting Kirtland warbler project, which Kirtland warbler prefers a very specific jack pine age. And what they're doing there is they're rotating their management in like different cycles. So they have it a large stand. I honestly don't know how many acres it is, but they've cut it out into four pieces and they're just rotating the management so that it's consistently providing that age class. And so I just thought that was so unique and creative and simple. And then you're constantly, kind of fueling the management there for Kirtland's in Michigan. So just kind of something to think about too. It doesn't have to just be jack pine, but like any other, if you have a stand and a large piece of land, you can rotate that management.
I wholeheartedly agree with what Keith said as far as the need to focus on the conditions that you're trying to create and not making sure that we box people in on the appropriate way or the best way to reach those conditions because it can vary dramatically from site to site. But to build also off of what Jayme said, at least in the East and across most of the Appalachians, certainly thinking about all the traditional forestry practices and tools that are at our fingertips to create those conditions, but we have to often start by thinking of invasive species, controlling those, thinking about what conditions we might create through our management that could allow invasive species that are there to spread or have better conditions to come in. And without thinking about that, we could have pretty disastrous unintentional effects of our management. And so to not cause any harm is important as well as trying to create conditions, change the conditions of the forests. And along with that, in some places, especially where I am here in Pennsylvania, we have to think about white-tailed deer browse. We have to think about protecting the young trees and plants that we're maybe creating through our management to make sure that they have a chance to be able to grow and make it past the deer browse height here. So thinking about invasive species and protecting plants from browse are two practices that are foundational, I think, in all of the other forestry practices that we can use as part of our toolbox in creating the habitat that migratory birds need.
Excellent. Let's see, Randy, do you want to add to this, or we can go on to our kind of our next area if you'd like, either way?
Yeah, I would probably just echo a lot of what has already been said. So I think why don't we move on?
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about forests. We've talked a lot about, or a fair amount about birds. The other part is people. And with half an eyeball on the Q&A, I noticed that we have some questions coming in about tools for working with landowners and land managers, etc. But I also, half an eyeball, see some questions related to edge effects. So I don't know, Randy, if that's something that you want to talk about a little bit, edge effects related to agriculture or related to fragmentation and and non-forested parcels, etc.
Yeah, I can take a stab at that to start off with. I think edge effects, particularly right between forest and non-forest, have been an area of concern because they tend to allow predators to kind of go into the forest further or access more of the forest. it potentially increases, predation events, mortality for either individuals or nests. But it also can be somewhat landscape dependent. So in landscapes that are highly forested, edges tend not to be as much of a concern. Whereas in landscapes where the proportion of forest and landscape gets below a certain level, and it might be somewhere in the 60 to 70% forest cover. That's when we start seeing more of those edge effects where predation increases into the forest. And birds tend to, more of the interior forest birds tend to avoid those edges too. So as fragmentation increases and those patch sizes decrease, those interior forest birds have less habitat than they're really looking for.
Yeah, thank you for that. And yeah, Taven is gonna jump in soon, I think, with an official Q&A, but this ties back kind of all of our themes of forests, birds, and people. Are there sort of spatial, I don't know, are there, let me I'm jumping ahead into the Q&A, I'm sorry. Are there where did this go? Thinking about a mosaic of habitats, and I'm sorry, it's better when Haven asks the questions, but can you speak about tools or techniques that planners can use to assess how different forest management scenarios may impact bird habitat across large scales? So this is kind of getting back to the people thing. Are there tools or techniques that can help people plan, forest management? And I would include, working with a small landowner as well as the large scales. But are there some planning tools that can help folks think about forest bird habitat management needs and how to address those? Jayme, I saw you
Yeah.
unmuted.
Oh, I saw Randy's unmuted too. So there's a lot of joint ventures here today. Tune into your joint venture websites. I think Lindsay shared them. There's a lot of many of these joint ventures have large high scale plans, but generally they link to state programs that you can tune into, which will give you like a forester or a biologist that can come out to your property and talk about your objectives and the landscape. But Partners in Flight also has a really great just tool sets for looking at the birds that are in your state or on your property, and then also the landscapes that those birds are supporting. So I would first recommend looking into your joint ventures and then also Partners in Flight, and then going back to those Forestry for the Birds programs. If your state has one, tune into it. If you don't have one, maybe get one started. I don't know. It starts somewhere with some really passionate people, and it can lead to really great collaboration across your state. So.
Can I add to that? I think everything Jayme said was perfect. And, getting assistance with your forestry planning, I think, is really critical if you're not a forestry planner yourself. There are also some great web tools out there. I'm going to just throw out one that I can think of off the top of my head, which is My Land Plan, which is an organization that helps with, kind of you working with your own property and developing a management plan and finding resources, and there's other tools like that out there. So I'm not just endorsing that one, but there's other tools like that can help you. But I think getting a professional to help you is probably your best first step. But there are definitely some cool tools out there now that you can also use.
Keith or Amanda, other planning tools that you would recommend, or things that reach people? It's okay. You're welcome to also share later in the chat. So I think we're going to pivot to the Q&A.
I was just going to say, somebody mentioned NRCS offices, and also extension offices can be really good if you have like a forestry extension program in your state. Those two are like excellent places to get information. Sorry to cut you off.
No, that's a great reminder. Yes, we love extension. We love to support more extension. So thanks for that. All right. So with that, let's see, Haven, Gwyneth, if you're able to add, let me see, maybe I can add spotlight. All right, Haven is part of our Brady Bunch now. Welcome, Haven. So,
Thank you. Back, I've dealt with technical gremlins for the last 15 minutes and so missed a little bit. So hopefully I don't repeat questions that have already been answered. But for participants, please continue to add your questions to the Q&A. And we had some questions about scale and landscape versus patch, and thinking in terms of many of us don't own big forest lands. We own a lot in the neighborhood or a small piece. And so the question is, you know, where do we begin? Is it impactful to manage around our home and smaller lands? And if so, what can we do to benefit forest dwelling birds in that kind of environment, knowing that we plan at a landscape scale, but we really do implement at the local scale?
I would say it's absolutely impactful to manage your small property as much as your big properties out there. I have a third of an acre here that I'm trying my best to provide. And just as when you're managing a forest, when you're managing the land around your home or a smaller piece of forest, you're just trying to think about how you can meet all of those full annual cycle needs for birds. And so providing as many native plants as you can to make sure you're offering food sources throughout the year, make sure you're maintaining cover. One of the best things you can do is, not rake your leaves and leave your flowers and grasses standing over the winter and into the spring, and keep your yard messy. Those kinds of places allow birds to find the food and the cover that they need throughout the year. But if you do own a smaller piece of forest within a broader forest landscape, just taking the time to look at that landscape, whether it's through Google Earth or just some other way to be able to visualize the forest around you and look at what's limiting in that landscape. Is there already a lot of young forest within that area? And if there isn't, then perhaps adding some young forest, even in your small area, but within a broader landscape of more mature forest, can start to fill in those gaps. So trying to think about whatever size of the property you own and how it fits into the broader landscape. All the professionals that we mentioned, those foresters that you can reach out to, can help you in seeing how your property fits in as a piece in that broader landscape. But just trying to think about birds, they don't see property lines and they don't care who owns what piece. So thinking about your piece, no matter how big or small it is, and how it fits into that broader landscape, and making sure that you're trying to add to what's available to them throughout the year.
I want to add some stats to what Amanda just said, because I've done exactly the same thing you're talking about. My last house was like a quarter acre lot, tiny, like the house was up against the property lines on both sides, right? And over 7 years, we did like you were suggesting, like replace lawn with native plants and shrubs and that kind of thing. And just to give you a sense of what you can accomplish with even that, we had 82 bird species in our yard over 7 years. 85% of them were forest birds, and 76% were migratory. So, so even on those little patches of land in a town, in city, you can attract a lot of things to your property. So, and that's with neighbors having nothing but lawn. Like that was my little oasis in town. So that can go a long way. So don't feel like that's not worth your time, because it really is.
awesome. Thank you. Jayme, I saw you smile real big and unmute earlier. Do you want to add to
Yeah.
that?
I just laugh because I have 2 acres and I just sit and battle buckthorn and autumn olive all the time. But yeah, removing those, if you have property, remove, invasives is like a simple task. And you think of grass is a monoculture. So just like changing some of your grass to a little prairie, or even just making windows safe. If you don't have property, go out and volunteer, hike in your local state parks or county parks, and you can even volunteer in those areas. But yeah, having safe windows and uh, also reducing pesticides on properties can really help as well. There's just a lot of different small things we can do. Uh, Even like outside of the forest, like thinking of the full annual cycle, buying bird-friendly coffee and chocolate because it's shade grown. It's not grown at a mass farm down in Central America where they winter. So just lots of different things. And Amanda and Amber had some great suggestions as well.
Awesome. And I saw Randy unmuted. Did you want to add to this?
Well, just real quick, I guess I would also make a plug for that, yeah, absolutely managing either even small pieces of forest that you have some control over, but also, if it's possible, talk with your neighbors, start some conversations about what they're interested in as well, and get a sense for how that landscape that you're in is, the interests of the landowners, and if there are common interests, you all can start working together towards a bigger plan too. So think about some community forestry kinds of approaches to things as well.
Um, Jayme, you mentioned invasives and the need to control invasives. And your example was around the house. We had a question about invasives more broadly in the sense of what considerations should managers have in managing forest to minimize the impacts of invasives or ensure that their practices don't promote the spread of them.
I might augment the question, and I see Keith unmuted, so be ready. I'm assuming the question is more about invasive plants, but we're also aware of invasive pests and pathogens, which are part of what's impacting the changing forest landscape for migratory forest birds. So with that, Keith, anything you want to say about invasives to answer Haven's questions?
I was just going to say that issue and the question highlights one of the many reasons that land managers, landowners should work with local knowledge and local conditions, because all of those play into how any particular action, any technique is going to encourage or discourage the expanse or the control of invasives. That's a concern in a lot of places where an otherwise positive activity for other reasons could end up opening up the canvas for invasives. And so that is soil and rainfall and all the climate variables and even local surrounding seed sources dependent. So back to you're aiming at a condition, but there may be better and worse ways to do that based on the threat of invasive.
Yeah, thank you.
Can
Amber.
I add a little story? As somebody that studies aspen forest, having spoken with a forester once who made kind of a critical error in his management, in that he didn't do a pre-harvest assessment before doing a timber operation and went out intending to regenerate aspen and instead came back and had to see a buckthorn and didn't think to look for the invasive plants before doing the timber management and treating those things first. Like, that should be your first step in any kind of operation, is to look for those invasive plants in particular, so that you don't spread them. And also, making sure that a logging contractor is cleaning their equipment, and probably not shovel clean equipment, probably like, spraying it down with water and like actually washing the equipment off before you move it between sites. Like, there's all these things that are like really critical, I think, for reducing these problems and not exacerbating them with our management techniques. And somebody mentioned in the chat how birds love some of these species, right? Because they have fruits on them, like honeysuckle and buckthorn and that kind of thing. And that may be true, but birds are also spreading them. They're like, they're part of the problem actually, in that they're spreading these things around. So my suggestion is to eliminate them, and if you feel like you need to replace them, put native fruiting shrubs in their places, so they provide the same function in terms of providing fruit, but are native species and not going to be creating the same problems.
Yeah, and as we've been, I think, becoming more aware also, the invasive shrubs in particular, while they provide sort of the right structure and sometimes some of those fruiting food sources, they tend not to support the insect diversity and abundance that native shrubs do either, which those insect resources are particularly important to the forest birds, particularly during the nesting period.
Well,
Yeah,
we had a
Doug
question.
Tallamy's books were mentioned. Everybody should read Doug Tallamy's books about that very topic.
Good recommendation. We had a question. Uh, have any of the panelists worked with land managers to develop plans where there was a goal to manage for late cereal stage or passively managed and also incorporate early successional habitat management? If so, what were some of the considerations you made in choosing your management for that area? How do you incorporate the range of variation?
Yeah, I've just started to do some of that work at this point, mostly with managers of conserved properties or not necessarily small private landowners, but it comes down to, in many cases, reading the land and seeing what characteristics are there to work with. I mentioned earlier that we can't make forests older. We can only promote the characteristics that tend to be associated with late successional or old growth forests. So looking at the forest and trying to see places that have some of those characteristics starting to develop already. And those are excellent places to concentrate some of the late successional management. So maybe areas that already have a few large trees. That's one of the limiting things, that it's hard to make trees grow too much faster, short of doing crop tree release or some of those practices. So finding areas that have maybe already some standing deadwood, some opportunities to create more deadwood on the ground. And so looking at areas that maybe have some sort of soil characteristics or things that lend themselves more towards creating that diversity of understory conditions that we tend to see associated with late successional forest. But then looking in areas to create young forests, we're looking for places that have in young forests, you're taking away the canopy, you're opening things up to sunlight. And so you want to find areas that don't have a high pressure of invasive species that are going to immediately respond to that. You want to focus on places that have desirable young trees already in the understory if you can, because those are the ones that are going to benefit. And if they're already established there, then they're going to be able to outcompete some of the invasives or less desirable species that are there. So essentially you want to take the time to walk with an expert, with a forester, to help you read the land and see what places have existing characteristics that lend themselves to being a better fit for placing young forest in an area, or have some traits that lend themselves better to late successional forest. And as we talked about before, as birds need those things to be connected, making sure that those are within proximity to one another, that birds are able to move between them throughout the year and find all the different habitat types that they need.
Awesome, thank you. I wonder if either or other joint venture folks have additional thoughts on that question of balancing the late successional with the early successional and trying to encourage people to address both if they have the means, or working with others to address that.
Yeah, Amanda's said it all, so just kidding. I think just looking at the joint venture, because it is difficult to at a larger scale to help manage like private and public lands. I posted in the chat a site in Wisconsin that's a state-owned property where they talk about managed old growth silvicultures, and they're studying it and different management techniques and how they're affecting that old growth stand. But there's also some young successional adjacent to it, and that's very important when I think Randy brought it up talking, or maybe it was Keith, the neighbors and talking to your neighbors about like where their forest is at, and just like, can you manage them side by side, or do something different, or like plan out your forest prescriptions in a certain way where you're like working across the landscape. And then with my job, I work a lot in public lands, but also touch on a lot of work with a lot of private land foresters and what they're providing for private land owners adjacent to those public lands. So it's a big task, and I can't say have it figured out yet. But it's definitely something that we can all keep working towards, and building relationships with our neighbors.
Can I build off that? Because I was actually part of that old growth silvicultural study in Wisconsin. And I think that's a really great example, especially for late successional forest management. And that study wasn't working in old growth. It was actually working in mature forest, but taking mature forest and managing in such a way as to create old growth like characteristics. It uses a process called disturbance mediated accelerated succession. That's a mouthful, but that's kind of the thought process behind what they were trying to do there, which kind of gets at what Amanda was saying. Like, it's a little bit of crop tree management, it's managing gaps, it's managing deadwood, it's trying to grow big trees faster, kind of thing. You're never going to have perfect old growth, but you can get some of the key characteristics that people think of when they define old growth. So I think that's like a really cool example of how you can use ecological forestry in a way to try to reach some of the goals and try to create forest that's relatively rare on the landscape, and trying to get there a little bit faster.
But a quick bow, I think, on all the good responses to the original question is, depending on the size and the context of the stand, you got to be ready to be okay with not checking all the boxes. It's okay that the size, context, landscape position of a forest stand or piece of property is not going to be suitable to get all of the pieces done. It's more important, I think, to tailor the activity to what that site is best suited, rather than trying to hit them all.
Thank you. Recognize we all see management through our own lens and life experiences, whether we're a forester or a biologist. Can you talk about the need for interdisciplinary teams to assess, plan, and implement management? Community ecology to assess system health and biodiversity often has vastly different lens than traditional forest-focused management.
Yeah, I'll jump on there, Haven. I don't have too much to comment, but I will say that we want to see a diverse forest, just like we want to see a diverse team of partners and collaborators on the back end. So it's really great to, I think I have the best job in the world, where I get to collaborate with all these different people and the biologists, natural resource managers. But yeah, those, back to that Forestry for the Birds program, we have a huge panel, all of those programs in each state that is has a program, has a lot foresters, biologists, natural resource managers, the high level planners and policy kind of get involved too, like the joint ventures and landowner, or did I already say landowners? But yeah, just having like multiple different perspectives of the forest really helps bring that biodiversity and ecological forestry that we're all looking for. So
Yeah, and I'll jump in on that too, Jayme. As someone who is a bird biologist, right? I'm not a trained forester by any way, shape, or form. Over the years, I've realized the value and importance of bringing, the knowledge of what the birds need together with the knowledge of what makes good forests and all the other ecological pieces that fit into a healthy ecosystem together. And I think, all the more these days, as we need our forests to do a lot of different things, both for us and for the environment and the wildlife. We need all those pieces of knowledge and experience working together as much as we can to keep healthy forests and support clean water and clean air and healthy wildlife populations as well. So I think it's just critically important that we all work together in those ways.
Yeah, I'd like to add there's often a missing piece to many of these teams, and that's having a social scientist be part of the process. Understanding what human behavior, what people do, what they want, what they value, is really, really important in this process. And it's often the piece that we overlook when we engage in our planning. So bringing in somebody that understands people perhaps better than the biologists and the foresters and myself do, I think is really important. And, seeking out those people can sometimes be challenging, but I think when you find somebody that understands the system a little bit, they can be tremendously helpful in crafting a plan that's going to be easier to implement, that's going to be more accepted by different groups, and will get to the root of some of the true problems that are out there as well that we're trying to address. So.
Thank you. Recognizing the value for managing forest lands to increase complexity and heterogeneity, how can land managers best convey to the public that managing forest requires sometimes a variety of silvicultural practices, whether it's thinnings or creating gaps or whatever your practice is, to emulate natural disturbance regimes to benefit wildlife? How do we convey that message to the public?
Well, to Amber's point, I think the first step is to make sure you're including professionals that understand people and understand effective messaging, and realizing that a lot of the things we're trying to communicate we can learn from marketing, and we can learn from lots of other areas that are about educating and changing people's minds. But ultimately, I think that it's important to recognize that a lot of people have emotional connections to places and to trees and to species, and to acknowledge that and affirm that a lot of us in working in this profession have that as well. And that's what led us to this work. And just making sure that people feel safe and that acknowledged in the fact that the initial disturbance activity can be hard to look at sometimes. It can be hard to watch trees being cut down, but that ultimately it is a beneficial practice, and to take them to places that have been managed a few years later, that having that open dialogue and saying it's okay that you feel connected to this place and don't want to see harm come to it. I don't either. And that's why we're managing it in this way. And just to have an open dialogue and not be so stoic and scientific about the fact that this is beneficial for birds. I can't see why you would be opposed to it. So communicating, connecting with people around the emotion and the love they have for these places, that ultimately could lead them to oppose what you're doing. But if you work through it the correct way, they can sometimes end up being your strongest advocates.
I can add to that. I also see the value in demonstration forests for this purpose, and having demonstrations on forests that are with the landowners you're trying to reach. So like if you're trying to reach private landowners, if you can show what other private landowners have done with their properties through field tours, field days, workshops, that kind of thing, that goes a long ways in terms of convincing people of the benefit of some of the practices that are being promoted. And so I think there's a lot that you can do through it's sort of like neighbors affecting neighbors, right? In a lot of ways, right? Like those people can be the biggest ambassadors and advocates in many ways, are the people that have done some of this already, and making them ambassadors for their neighborhood, or people in their region, I think can go a long ways to convincing other people that they can do something similar on their land.
most often way more effective than hearing the exact same message from a biologist.
So we are getting very close to our closeout time. I wonder if anybody has any take-home thoughts that you'd want to share. You know, what are you taking away as our panelists from this conversation? Now you're all shy.
Uh, so I I even wrote down what I wanted to say because I think for me, working with forest management and birds, the biggest thing is building relationships and having those strong partnerships takes time. And it's important though, because that's how we work across the landscape and how we spread outreach and education of best management practices with the science. And it takes time, and we need to keep communicating with our partners and work together to find creative ways to support one another, especially in our changing system right now, with conservation. Like, we just being creative and working with one another is going to be how we move forward. And my last take home is to listen to the science and the monitoring. Our birds serve, they're important habitat indicators for our forests. And so what they're doing is kind of telling us what the forest health looks like. So those are my takeaways. But I'm sure our experts will have much better takeaways than that.
Those are all great. Any other quick takeaways?
Something for me that I hope folks take from this webinar is that it's, I think, a really important lesson for us all to learn, that we need to be more comfortable and embrace change and uncertainty in forestry and forest management and conservation careers. It's a hard thing to do, of course, but I think that we need to let go of the idea that we can manage our forests or try to leave them in a state of being unchanged or return them to some point in history that we're not going to be able to meet anymore. And so to think about how we can use management as a tool to provide these forests the best chance they have at maintaining their function and being able to serve as high quality habitat and making sure that they can stay as diverse and productive as possible in all of the challenges that they're facing and in all of the change that is certainly coming.
Awesome, thank you. Let's go real quick on the last few. Randy.
Yeah, I think maybe just building on that, Amanda, the idea that to manage a particular place, forest, we really need to try and understand the context in which it is in and the site-specific conditions that it currently exists in. And as already, we've been sharing a lot of great tools. Lindsay, you've been amazing at putting stuff up there in the chat. And there are a lot of people to help with doing that. It's not necessarily easy, but we are growing our knowledge and our community around being able to do that. So, find your people where you're at and help you look at what that forest currently is and what you would like it to be. And working through that process over time is going to get us to where we all want to be eventually.
Wonderful. I'm so sorry to not let Amber and Keith go. We do need to have a hard stop for NCTC. I'm sorry. But thank you to our panelists so much for speaking today with each other, with all of our participants here. This is wonderful. I want to mention if you need SAF CEUs, I think there was a message, but email Jim Siegel. And the next webinar is May 20th on managing wetland forests for wildlife. So Keith will probably listen in, and there will be lots of great speakers on that one as Haven is facilitating, I believe. Gwyneth, sorry to make the hard pivot to close out, but Gwyneth, did you want to give any final notes from NCTC?
No, we are very excited to keep on doing this series, and we're very excited for the next webinar. Thank you to our panel this time. You guys did great. I'm so excited to hear about how not only are you doing forest habitat for birds in your job, but also in your own backyard. That's fantastic, and it gives me hope that I can do it in my own. So, yeah. Thank you all for sharing your skills and expertise. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks so much to everybody for joining. Have a wonderful day.